Good morning. So, we're in the book of Exodus, and as we get further and further into a book like this, you're going to start to notice some strange occurrences. Things like Mount Horeb, called the Mountain of God, and then sometimes it's called Mount Sinai. You're going to see that if you're really hardcore, you might notice that, Moses is in Midian, and then he takes his sheep to Mount Sinai or Horeb, but it's really far away from each other and almost impossible that you would take your sheep that far. You might notice things like that as Moses heads out to Egypt with his entire family, and then later it's going to say, and then his son ran out to meet him later. And so you got a couple of these things that are not really easily accounted for, specifically if you want to see everything as literal versus inspired. So as you kind of wrestle with those discrepancies, there's a phrase that I want you to take heart in, and that is this: historical memory. So let me give you an example. In my family's history, we have a story about my great-great-grandfather who was Irish, and he impregnated a black woman, most likely a black enslaved woman who was brought to Jamaica, whose daughter is my great-grandmother, my father's grandmother. And what is told to me is that she was known for her distinct red hair and her very, very fair skin. Now, this genealogical record, as I remember it, was always told to me in the summertime because my hair would go red. I would get little red strands. Now they're all white. All the ones that were red are now white. And we would be reminded of the story of our ancestors, a piece of our history. And so while there's truth to that story, it's very much a historical memory, whose deeper context and details get more and more thin with every generation that goes by. So a historical memory, and I'm sure your family has them too, stories that you know that have been told to you, but you have to kind of fill in some of the gaps. Something that you can retell in your own words that you didn't experience, that you didn't witness, but you know that it actually happened, and that your version holds at least some essence of the real experience. And so this is an idea that you have to keep in mind as you go through a book like Exodus, so you do not find yourself ignoring or stumbling over some of those small challenges that are found in the text, or being consumed by kind of these interpretations that feel challenging when we think about our ideas about God as found in Jesus. So I don't want you to ignore them, especially if you're kind of a hardcore studier. And if you are, I'm happy to have conversations, someone to join me. But I hope that these won't limit our capacity to ask ourselves, the text and the Spirit, this question: what is the wisdom from the passage? What is the wisdom in the passage that met the contextual needs of the early readers? And are there ways that this can speak into our own context and into our own situations? So, this morning's passage that we heard read by Isaiah, it took me back to when I was a teenager. And because I guess I was not very popular, one of the things that I found fun to do was I would read all of the time. And one of the books that I stumbled upon was a book by Philip Yancey called Disappointment with God. And I was getting ready for today. I reread a portion of it, and I found myself immersed in one of the introductory stories of a young man named Richard. So if you've read the book, you'll be familiar with it. Now, Richard's story today would be something that you would find in little snapshots or reels all over Instagram, and it would be a really interesting one to follow. It would be on TikTok, and it would really resonate well with those who are kind of called the evangelicals, those who once found themselves enamored with evangelicalism and now have questions and are rethinking or reconstructing their faith. Now, there's one part of his story that stood out the most in his journey to understand God as active and present, reliable and responsive. And that's when he stumbled upon Catherine Kuhlman. Is anyone familiar with this person? Okay, a few. So Catherine Kuhlman is a well-known evangelist who was known for her gift of healing. And he said that when he kind of stumbled upon her televised service, he was so enamored. He was so excited about all of these people who received these radical healings. And he was relieved. He was relieved because his questions about God were answered. He had now found something that was tangible to consider in his longing to be connected to a God who could be trusted. And a few weeks later, he heard that the same woman was coming to a city near him, and he was ecstatic. And so he was finally going to have an opportunity to see this face to face, this opportunity to engage with the God that he longed to be live and upfront. And so he went to the service, and of course the energy was high, and people were praying, and the songs were dynamic, and every once in a while, someone would shout out, "I'm healed." And one person in particular stood out to him. A man who was a doctor was brought into the space, and he was on a stretcher. He'd had lung cancer, and he came and he couldn't really move, and he was heading towards death. And so they brought him, and as he came forward, they prayed for him, and he stood up, the man stood up, and the man said he was healed. Now for Richard, who was a newer Christian, he was ecstatic. And he wrote the man's name down with the intent of following up so he could let this man know that this single experience had transformed him and had convinced him and given him the proof he needed that he can lean into a living God. So he looked up this number, and this would have been a long time ago because this book was written in the 80s. So he looked up the number in the ways, I don't even know how you did it back then, but he looked up a number, and he dialed it. I really don't know how you would have looked it up. How did you do it? Yeah, but if you don't know enough about the person, you can't. Well, maybe. I don't know. Anyway. Okay. You have to go to every city, get every phone book. Okay. So he looked up the number. About 3 weeks later, he dialed it. And when he asked for the man, the woman on the phone was a bit alarmed. And she was like, "Who are you? How did you get our number?" And so he explained a little bit more about his enthusiasm and why he wanted to speak to this man. And her only response as she hung up was, "My husband is dead." And the phone ended. That was the beginning of his kind of descent as he started to feel that his faith and his ideas about God didn't quite match up. He was devastated. And as the title of the book outlines, he was disappointed with God. That moment is when he kind of goes into a descent. And he says to Yancey at one point, he says, "Nobody is out there." Up until now, if you've been following in the book of Exodus, we have encountered Moses' birth, where we were reminded that the God who saw us is the God who sees us. Last week, we met Moses as he encounters God in the wilderness and finds himself invited to participate in the liberation of his people. Despite being unqualified and unwilling, he was the one that God had in mind to act on their behalf. And God simply reminds him over and over again, "I will be with you." And today, we meet Moses as he leaves his father-in-law, packs up his family, performs a forced circumcision. You can read about that. It's quite entertaining if you want, which may or may not be a way that the editors kind of helped to legitimize Moses as being one that was sent by God. He meets up with his brother Aaron, who helps him convey to the Israelites that God has not forgotten them and that Moses is going to be the one to bring them towards their freedom. And when Moses and Aaron find their way to Pharaoh, they request that the people should be allowed to go to the desert. They should be able to go to worship their God. And despite Moses even suggesting that their very lives were at risk if they did not go, Pharaoh says, no. I thought it'd be some. So I was wondering if anyone thought he would say yes. Probably doesn't fit with my disappointment introduction. And so his no is accompanied by suggesting that the Israelites are lazy, that they're not accomplishing enough, they're not fast enough, and he responds by increasing their workload while eliminating the means and supplies to get the work done. And the people are once again crushed, they're devastated and filled with great sorrow as they are given harsher, more crippling, and oppressive tasks than before. And you can imagine the Israelites who have just heard from Moses and Aaron who said, "We arrived to free you." They're outraged. "We thought you said God was going to save us. We thought you said God was going to free us. We thought you said that God was on our side. We thought you told us that God was going to end our oppression, that this was the moment that was the end of our demise and our great disappointment, the end of our sorrow, but instead the pursuit of freedom has simply left us in a worse position than before you arrived. We didn't know that it could get worse than it has been, worse than our mothers and fathers have known, worse than those who have gone before us have experienced. You told us God was one way, but the evidence suggests that God is absent and silent and unreliable, as we already understood." And in that moment, Moses knew that what each one of us in this room understands. A little bit of hope is a very powerful thing, but it can also be proved dangerous when it does not produce that which we hoped for. When the storm still comes, when the sickness remains, when betrayal goes unmoved, when the outcome isn't what we were promised, when justice is misplaced, when wickedness is rewarded, when goodness is looked down on, when the light goes out, when it seems that darkness wins. And in Exodus 5, Moses says, "Why did you send me? Ever since I came, things have just gotten worse, and you have done nothing to rescue them." Words perhaps we ourselves have wanted to say to God. You have done nothing to rescue us. This week we heard that Lebanon was bombed. We heard that Iran sent out missiles. We saw a boat capsized, filled with asylum seekers from the Congo. This week, we watched our friends struggle. We heard stories of sadness. We experienced some loss, and we found ourselves in some dark spaces. We cried and we mourned, and we found ourselves echoing the oppressed and the enslaved Israelites, the frustrated and defeated Moses, as we shout out from the core of our being that you have done nothing to rescue us. You've done nothing to step in for us, to save us, to be present for us, to reveal yourself as faithful to us. You have left us in the dark. So where is the wisdom in the text? Well, let us remind ourselves that while Exodus is a historical event, this telling is most likely a historical memory. So it's written and edited and added to in ways to help a people understand and learn something about their history, but also about how they as people can be connected to God. Which is most likely why the writer then follows up Moses' prayer with this immediate response from God. Almost as though they want the readers to understand that when it gets dark, when it is hard to see and difficult to imagine that God cares about your freedom, that God is working for your liberation, that God is interested in you making your way to the promised land, When it's hard for you to see God, God does not find it hard to see you. In Exodus, that sounds like God responding to Moses with these words, "Now you will see what I will do," which translates into a myriad of supernatural events, ups and down, sensing at times that God is active and others that God is silent. So what about us? What about when we find ourselves in the same space of disappointment that the Israelites did or that Moses experienced? When do we get to hang on to these same words, "Now you will see what God will do"? Yancey kind of tackles this picture of God at work in the midst of all that seems God is not working by inviting us to consider the word faith. He describes faith as these childlike gulps when someone swallows the impossible. And he calls that seed faith. And he says that kind of faith can feed a house full of orphans or move a mountain. And that the Bible contains many proddings in that direction. But childlike trust may not survive when the miracle doesn't come. When the urgent prayer gets no answer, when a dense gray mist obscures any sign of God's concern, such times call for something more, the hang on at any cost kind of faith. That kind of faith involves learning to trust that out beyond the perimeter of fog, God still reigns and has not abandoned us, no matter how it may appear. In Exodus, time and time again, we are going to encounter what we often expect of God. A sea that miraculously opens so Israelites can walk on dry ground. A stick that turns into a snake. Water that turns into blood. Outrageous events that even if just one were to occur in our lifetime, we might be compelled to announce that we have seen what God can do. But one of the narratives that prevails within the text are the ways that these dramatic actions produce very short-lived effects that are easily and quickly forgotten. The type of faith that Yancey describes as that which persists even in the dark, and as Barbara Brown Taylor suggests, because of the dark, is modeled in Jesus as he faces the cross. It is there, in the pain and the humiliation and sacrifice of that moment, that his humanity shouts out in an accusation in the direction of God as he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" Yet moments later, as he dies, he offers his spirit to the very God he previously sensed had left him. And in that moment, as he lives in the reality of all that he sees and all that he suffers, he equally lives in the reality of the God whose very essence whispers to the heart of disappointment, "Now you will see what I will do." Words that seem sufficient for Moses, words that seem somehow divine enough for Jesus, but words in our disappointment we insist are for others, but not for ourselves. Yancey takes this reality and he helps us understand how we too might be able to both hear and receive those same words from ourselves when we turn our attention to the famous words found in Romans chapter 8. All things work. Anyone? Oh, you guys know the whole thing. Some Sunday school students who got stickers when they memorized the verse. Shoot. It's on the screen and we still can't do it. All right, give me back your stickers. So those famous words, which many of us have heard from this well-known passage, are often distorted. And some people interpret it to mean that only good things will happen to those who love God. But if you read through the passage, you'll see that Paul must have meant quite the opposite, as in the very next paragraph, he defines what things we might expect. Trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, sword. Paul endured all of those. Yet he insists, in all these things, we are more than conquerors. No amount of hardship can separate us from the love of God. Paul, if anyone, understood what it was to encounter moments, days, and years when it seemed that God had left him, that God's promises were not for him, that God was silent and unaware. Yet what Paul offers to us in Romans 8 is his why for faith, for hope, for deep belief that God remains despite all that announces around us that God had left him. And it is this: nothing can separate us from the love of God. Paul had every reason to believe that to follow and to remain faithful, to persist, had caused him more harm than good. It was his following of God and following the way of Jesus that led him to imprisonment, that led him to shipwreck, that led him to snake bites, that led him to all kinds of isolation and loss. Yet there is one thing that sustains him. There's one thing that holds him when disappointment wants to crush him, and it is this: that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Can you hear that speaking over that which says God has left you? Can you feel its weight pushing against all that suggests that God has failed you? Can you see the way it defies all that insists you are alone and forgotten and unworthy of a God who hears? Now you will see what I will do. In Exodus 5, Moses' words to Pharaoh lead to great sorrow and oppression. And so we understand his outrage at the injustice, and we recognize he is justified in his complaints. But right there in the heart of his disappointment and his certainty that God cannot be trusted, God speaks. Now you will see what I will do. In our situation, in our stories, in our loss, when we come face to face with great sorrow and oppression and sense deep outrage at the injustice that we encounter and that we bear witness to, we are justified in our complaints against God. But right there in the heart of our disappointment and our certainty that God cannot be trusted, God speaks. Now you will see what I will do. Now you will see what I am doing. Love is rising. Love surrounds you. Love will carry you, and love will speak. Love will comfort in unexpected ways and whisper and remain even when everything else is shattered. Love will consume and take over even when you cannot say its name. Even when you are certain it has left you, love will flow into the very spaces that circumstances announced could never be reopened. Love will win because nothing, absolutely nothing can separate us, can separate me, can separate you. Nothing can keep us from the love that is God. The God who saw you is the God who sees you. The God who calls you is the God who will be with you. The God we are certain has disappointed us is the God who insists that their great love cannot be separated from us. Now you will see what I will do. So, Barbara Brown Taylor has these words which I hope help us close off well. She says, "At this stage of my life, this sounds like a fifth gospel, in which the good news is that dark and light, faith and doubt, divine absence and presence do not exist at opposite poles. Instead, they exist with and within each other, like distinct waves that roll out of the same ocean and roll back into it again. As different as they are, they come from and return to the same source. If I can trust that, if I can give my heart to it and remain conscious of it, then faith becomes a verb. My active response to the sacred reality that the best religions in the world can only point to. This faith will not offer me much to hold on to. It will not necessarily give me a safe place to settle. Practicing it will require me to celebrate the sacraments of defeat and loss. But since the religion I know best has a lot to say about losing as the precondition for finding, I can live with that. I think I can even live inside this cloudy evening of the soul for a while longer, where even my sense of God's absence can be a token of God's presence if I let it. Because I do not understand a thing about this. Does that mean I understand God? I do not know. All I know is that there is no place that I would rather be. As we go through this week, as we encounter what we see on the news and what we hear from friends and families around us, it is easy to be consumed by the darkness and to feel like the darkness in itself is simply the absence of God, rather than to seek out where is that beautiful picture of the love that is God present within it. How is God speaking? How is God moving? And how am I hearing even in the silence? This week, as you pray and as you remember, we're meeting for prayer tomorrow at 12 on Zoom. But as you are praying, I want you to remember those who we have sponsored, who are in Canada now, specifically from the Middle East, those from Syria and Lebanon, who are now terrified as their homes and the homes of their families are being obliterated, as there's great fear within them, as they are unsure of what is next and what is to come. And so we have so many people connected to us from those regions because of our work with ASIG. And so remember them. They're suffering, they're struggling, they are so deeply concerned. Let us pray for Iran and Lebanon. Let us pray for Israel. And above all, let us pray for peace as we go into this week. Have a blessed week.